For the past 3 decades, the institutional consensus held. Capital moved freely. Borders functioned as administrative checkpoints, not structural barriers. The Common Reporting Standard emerged not as a threat, but as a coordination instrument, a mechanism to synchronize fiscal residency data across jurisdictions that were theoretically aligned. The architecture of globalization was built on that alignment. What we are witnessing now is not a policy adjustment, it is a phase transition. The operational era of global cooperation, defined by synchronized regulatory frameworks, mutual recognition treaties, and the presumption of cross-border institutional goodwill, has structurally terminated. What has replaced it is sovereign containment. Governments are no longer positioning themselves as nodes in a cooperative network. They are repositioning as perimeter operators. Capital controls, exit taxation, unrealized capital gains levies, beneficial ownership registries. These are not isolated legislative experiments. They are load-bearing components of a new containment architecture. The jurisdictional perimeter is hardening. The question for every high net worth principal is not whether this shift is real. The structural evidence is unambiguous. The question is whether your current architecture was designed to function inside a containment environment, or whether it was designed for a world that no longer exists. The phrase sovereign exit is frequently misread. It is not an emotional response. It is not a statement of political allegiance or ideological preference. It is a precision maneuver, a calculated architectural transition executed in advance of structural deterioration, not in reaction to it. The distinction is critical. Reactive relocation is executed under duress, inside a compressed decision window, after the sovereign has already asserted jurisdictional claim over your capital base. At that point, exit costs are maximized, optionality is minimized, and the architecture you build is a product of constraint rather than design. A sovereign exit, executed correctly, is the opposite. It is a pre-crisis repositioning, a deliberate partition of fiscal residency, domicile, and asset containment across jurisdictions with structurally incompatible legal frameworks. You are not fleeing a jurisdiction. You are engineering a capital structure that is no longer singularly exposed to one sovereign's mandate. Fiscal residency becomes a design variable. The Common Reporting Standard becomes a mapping tool rather than a surveillance instrument, because your architecture was built with full awareness of its reporting pathways. Unrealized capital gains exposure is neutralized through jurisdictional compartmentalization before the triggering event. This is architectural precision. Every component of the transition, entity structure, trustee jurisdiction, banking relationships, domicile selection, treaty positioning, is a deliberate engineering decision. And every decision that is not made in advance becomes a variable that the sovereign controls for you. There is a metric that every institutional-grade architect applies before and during a crisis: structural optionality. It measures not what your architecture is worth today, but what decisions it preserves under adverse conditions. A capital structure with high structural optionality can reroute. It can partition exposure. It can activate pre-positioned conduits without requiring sovereign approval, without triggering catastrophic tax events, without collapsing beneficial ownership across consolidated reporting regimes. A structure with low structural optionality cannot. When the containment perimeter tightens, it has no redundancy, no jurisdictional separation, no pre-built legal pathways to activate. The decision tree is binary and it resolves against you. This structural optionality audit maps your current architecture against 5 pressure axes: fiscal residency, flexibility, entity jurisdictional portability, banking corridor redundancy, treaty network depth, and unrealized capital gains exposure management. Most legacy wealth structures, built during the era of global cooperation, fail on 3 or more of these axes. They were not designed for sovereign containment. They were designed for a cooperative environment that is structurally expired. This audit is not a theoretical exercise. It is a pre-flight integrity check, a systematic assessment of whether your architecture can function under the operating conditions that now exist. The common reporting standard data flows are already active. Fiscal residency determinations are already being made. Unrealized capital gains legislation is already moving through multiple legislative chambers simultaneously. The audit tells you whether you are inside the containment perimeter or outside it. The moment you commission the audit, you stop being a passive subject of jurisdictional exposure and become an active principal in your own capital's architecture. That is the threshold. Inaction is not a neutral position. It is a structural decision, one that transfers agency to the sovereign and reprices your capital base accordingly. The mechanism is not theoretical. When a high net worth individual remains domiciled within a single jurisdiction without a pre-positioned exit architecture, every legislative development in that jurisdiction is a direct exposure event. Unrealized capital gains taxes do not require a realization event to create liability. They impose obligation based on accrued value within the sovereign's fiscal perimeter. Exit taxes impose structural penalties on the act of leaving after the fact. Beneficial ownership registries consolidate your asset map inside a government database that is, by definition, subject to that government's mandate. Fiscal residency determinations, once made, are difficult and expensive to reverse. The Common Reporting Standard has removed information asymmetry from the equation. The sovereign knows what you hold and where you hold it. The cost of inaction, therefore, is not a static number. It is a compounding structural liability. Every month that passes without architectural repositioning is a month in which the containment perimeter tightens, exit costs increase, and the legislative environment shifts further against capital mobility. The repricing is not linear. It accelerates as containment deepens. And critically, the transition from low-cost to high-cost exits is not announced. It occurs inside legislative cycles that move faster than most private wealth review cycles. By the time the repricing is visible, the window for low-friction repositioning has frequently already closed. We must address the most significant obstacle to sovereign agency, the integrity gap. Look at the schematic. On the surface, your current financial architecture appears solid. It is a structure you have trusted for years. It consists of layers you were told were secure, entities that were described as compliant, and structures that were marketed as robust. But look closer at the cross-section. What you perceive as a solid, unified foundation is, in reality, a series of disconnected, brittle compartments. What you see as a seamless integration of your assets is actually a collection of structural stress fractures. You see a fortified bunker. The reality is an exposed conduit system. The legislation that has passed in the last 24 months, the Common Reporting Standard mandates, the automatic information exchanges, the new unrealized capital gains frameworks, these have acted as high-pressure solvents. They have dissolved the perceived strength of your existing structures. The integrity gap is the psychological distance between the security you believe you possess and the reality of the exposure you actually hold. It is the primary reason most principals remain paralyzed. To acknowledge this gap is to admit that the advice you relied upon was built for a different world. It is to admit that the safe harbor you occupied has been rezoned as a containment zone. Confronting this gap is the most difficult stage of the sovereign shelter process. It requires you to set aside the comfort of your current narrative and face the structural reality. Your architecture is not failing because you haven't worked hard enough. It is failing because it was never designed to resist the containment pressure it is now facing. Acknowledging the gap is not a defeat. It is the first step towards structural integrity. The Sovereign Shelter Framework reframes what wealth stewardship means at the institutional level. It is not a completed project. It is a long-duration mandate. A sovereign-grade capital structure is not assembled once and then held in static form. It is actively maintained, stress-tested against current legislative environments, and recalibrated as jurisdictional conditions evolve. This is the operational reality that distinguishes institutional principles from retail-grade wealth holders. The institutional principle understands that fiscal residency is a dynamic variable, not a fixed status. They monitor Common Reporting Standard treaty modifications. They track unrealized capital gains legislative proposals across multiple jurisdictions simultaneously. They maintain pre-positioned entity structures in jurisdictions with incompatible legal frameworks, so that no single sovereign event can collapse the entire architecture. They treat the sovereign shelter not as a destination reached, but as a system under continuous management. The mandate is jurisdictional integrity over time, not a one-time repositioning event. This distinction has material consequences. Architectures that are built and then neglected drift, entities lapse, treaty protections expire, banking corridors close, trustee jurisdictions change their regulatory posture. The architecture that was sound in year 1 is frequently compromised by year 5 if it is not actively stewarded. Institutional stewardship means building a review protocol into the architecture itself, a systematic scheduled audit cycle that measures structural optionality, identifies emerging jurisdictional risk, and executes recalibration before deterioration becomes irreversible. The cycle of fragmentation is the operational map of where we are. It is not a forecast. It is a structural description of the geopolitical and legislative environment as it currently exists. The cycle moves through 4 phases. Phase 1 is coordination, characterized by synchronized regulatory frameworks and mutual recognition. Phase 2 is divergence, where jurisdictions begin asserting independent legislative agendas and treaty networks begin to fracture. Phase 3 is containment, where perimeter controls harden, information sharing becomes unilateral rather than reciprocal, and capital mobility is structurally penalized. Phase 4 is fragmentation, where the regulatory environment becomes jurisdictionally inconsistent, enforcement becomes selective, and the cost of being improperly positioned becomes terminal for capital structures that were not designed for the new environment. We are currently operating in Phase 3, with leading indicators of Phase 4 consolidation already visible in multiple G20 legislative environments. Unrealized capital gains proposals, beneficial ownership mandate expansions, and fiscal residency enforcement upgrades are all Phase 3 containment instruments. The final audit is the question every principal must answer honestly. Where does my current architecture sit on this cycle? Is it positioned for Phase 2, a cooperative environment that has already passed? Or is it engineered for Phase 3 containment and Phase 4 fragmentation? Common reporting standard exposure, fiscal residency concentration, unrealized capital gains vulnerability, entity portability. These are the 4 structural metrics that determine your position. The threshold for institutional grade architecture is clear. The gap between your current position and that threshold is the quantifiable cost of inaction. The gate is open. The sovereign shelter briefing is the diagnostic working session where your current architecture is mapped against the institutional threshold, jurisdiction by jurisdiction, entity by entity, exposure by exposure. This is not a sales presentation. It is a structural audit delivered by practitioners who operate at the intersection of fiscal residency strategy, jurisdictional engineering, and sovereign risk containment. The link is below. If your architecture was built for a world that no longer exists, the briefing is where that gap is quantified and where the recalibration begins. The window for low friction repositioning is not permanent. Book the sovereign shelter briefing now.
Join our community of informed investors to stay ahead. This data is for education and is not financial advice. Always consult a professional before investing. To speak with one of our specialists, click the link in the description. I'll see you in the next report.